Good evening. Thank you all for coming. What a lot of people have turned up. My name is Ray Perman. I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the last in our series of Politicians and Professionals 2017, in which we ask the leaders of the 5 political parties at Holyrood to speak to us. We're very grateful again for having the support of the professional associations, for ICAS, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Scotland, the Law Society of Scotland, the Faculty of Advocates, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the Young Academy of Scotland. And we support very much the work that the Young Academy is doing. And after the First Minister has spoken, I shall ask Dr. Victoria Martin just to tell us a little bit, very briefly, about the work of the Young Academy. Now, Victoria is a particle physicist, and I had hoped that she might explain the importance of the Higgs boson to us in 30 seconds or so, but she says she's got much more important things to talk about. She's going to talk about the work of the Young Academy in improving diversity in academic life. We're very grateful too to Ellie Wiseman for chairing the Q&A this evening. Now, those of you who were here a year ago will remember that at 6 o'clock I was standing here telling that I could see the First Minister on my mobile phone while she made a presentation to the Scottish Parliament about the conclusion of the fiscal framework negotiations. And when she did arrive, she told us that she'd been negotiating with George Osborne that afternoon, if you can remember him. And a lot has changed in the last year. We had elections for the Scottish Parliament in May, and the First Minister was returned to head her second administration, this time with a minority government rather than a majority. And of course, we've had the Brexit vote in the referendum after that. The Scottish Government issued a paper in the autumn making its position on the relationship with Europe very clear. It wants Scotland to stay in the single market, and that is diametrically opposed to the position which the UK government has taken. People have speculated that this might lead to a second independence referendum for Scotland, and the First Minister said, first of all, that was possible, then that it was very likely, and then it was highly likely. Certainly the markets think that it's possible, because yesterday the pound fell against the dollar, we're told, on the expectation that there might be a second independence referendum. We're also told that the UK Cabinet spent its last meeting last week discussing the possibility of a second referendum, and that the Prime Minister will make her views known at the Conservative Party Scottish Conference at the end of this week in Glasgow. She is going to argue that a referendum is unnecessary and shouldn't take place. Will we have a referendum? Well, no pressure at all on you, Nicola, but if you could enlighten us, I think we'd all be very grateful. Thank you.
I thought if it was okay with you, Ray, I would just take the opportunity this evening to name the date. I see some journalists in the room, so it's getting close to deadlines. I'm not sure if they would appreciate it. Anyway, what a pleasure it is to be back here with you this evening. I have come to value over the past 4 years, it is now, as I'm sure all of the other party leaders do, the opportunity to discuss with you some of the key issues that are facing our country now and for the future. When I first spoke here, not for the very first time, but the first time as SNP leader, it was in the aftermath of the independence referendum. Last year, of course, it was during the run-up to the Scottish Parliament elections and the EU referendum. And as Ray has just said, I came hot foot from Parliament, having just concluded the fiscal framework discussions with the Chancellor of the day, George Osborne. And Therefore, given the events of these last 2 years, I'm sure I was not alone in hoping that 2017 might turn out to be a slightly quieter year in Scottish politics. It's fair to say it hasn't turned out that way. Ray asked me earlier on if I thought 2018 might be quieter or if they should plan to have this series of events again. Possibly quieter, but the way things are going, I wouldn't want to make any rash promises. So perhaps you should just plan on the basis of having us all here again next year as well. Obviously, we live in times that are unpredictable. Within a month, and this is perhaps the most predictable aspect of the next few months, we will see the UK government formally triggering Article 50, which will set the United Kingdom on what, as far as we know, although it hasn't been legally tested, is an irrevocable course towards leaving the European Union. And so this evening, perhaps not surprisingly, I want to talk about that. I'm not planning, though, to concentrate this evening on the likely impact that leaving the EU and the single market would have on the UK and Scotland. Although, as you know, I believe very firmly that Brexit's effects will be profound, long-lasting and damaging to our economy, to our society and indeed to our place in the world, perhaps our very sense of identity. But instead this evening I want to concentrate more specifically on what Brexit means for democracy in Scotland, how it has exposed the democratic deficit that still exists at the heart of our governance, and what options we have for addressing that. But firstly, I want to look backwards, because while it might be hard to believe, certainly for those of us who campaigned in it, this year marks the 20th anniversary of another referendum. This year is the 20th anniversary of the referendum that led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And that referendum, of course, confirmed overwhelming support for devolution. The creation of the Scottish Parliament was supported by almost 3/4 of those who voted in that referendum. And it's maybe worth thinking back to why that decision was so resounding, so overwhelming. The campaign for a Scottish Parliament was based, above all, on the idea that we faced in Scotland a democratic deficit. Decisions were being taken for Scotland, very often by governments we didn't vote for, rather than by Scotland. The late Canon Kenyon Wright made the argument well in 1989 on the very first day of the Scottish Constitutional Convention. And of course he was speaking then 2 days before the poll tax came into force in Scotland. And he said this then about the UK Parliament: again and again it has debated measures which have affected quite fundamentally Scotland's national institutions and the quality of life of our people. Again and again the elected representatives of the Scottish people have voted against these damaging policies. Again and again and again Parliament has imposed these on Scotland. Now, of course, the poll tax wasn't the only example of this democratic deficit. Many social and economic policies of the 1970s and 80s, such as the way in which deindustrialisation was handled across many parts of the country, would also stand as examples. But there's no doubt that the poll tax, perhaps more than anything else, came to exemplify that democratic deficit. It was implemented in Scotland despite overwhelming public opposition, and perhaps the overriding reason that so many people in 1997 endorsed the idea of a Scottish Parliament was to prevent that, or indeed anything like that, ever happening again. And in many respects, of course, the Scottish Parliament in that respect has been a significant, resounding success. It has now firmly established itself as the centre of Scottish public life, the institution that people expect and most trust to reflect their priorities, values and aspirations. Devolution has enabled us to pursue a different approach to politics. Now, I wouldn't want to overstate the case here. Scottish politics, and I'm being polite here, is never knowingly non-tribal. But at the very least, even if it hasn't yet influenced sufficiently the behaviours of political parties, the modern working practices of Holyrood are far removed from some of the more arcane rituals of Westminster. And the fact we have proportional representation as the means of electing our Parliament means that a search for consensus, a degree of give and take and negotiation, is much more part and parcel of the Scottish parliamentary system than it is of the Westminster one. But of course, the contrast between the Scottish and UK parliaments isn't just one of approach. There have also been significant differences in policy. Early Scottish parliaments saw measures such as world-leading homelessness legislation and the ban on smoking in public places. The government that I've been part on and now have the privilege of leading reintroduced free university tuition, set the most ambitious climate change targets in the world. It has also legislated for a minimum price for alcohol, although frustratingly that is a measure still caught up in the courts. It has also chosen to mitigate the impact of UK government welfare cuts, the bedroom tax, for example, and taken steps to expand early years education and childcare. All of these are significant achievements of devolution, and I should stress very strongly that they belong to more than one government and to more than one party. One of the areas where the contrast with UK governments has been perhaps most obvious in recent years has been our approach to universal benefits. The Scottish Parliament has chosen to provide, defend and indeed extend certain core universal services, rights and benefits. And that decision helps households across the country. It helps, for example, students who benefit from higher education without £9,000 a year of debt for tuition costs, older people who are entitled to concessionary bus travel and, if they're eligible, free personal care, commuters who no longer pay tolls across the Forth Bridge, or families who benefit from a health service which is free at the point of delivery. Before 2007, more than 500,000 people in Scotland who earned as little as £16,000 a year paid for prescriptions. Now, as you know, the Scottish Parliament decided last week that higher rate taxpayers in Scotland would have a different tax threshold from taxpayers in the rest of the UK. Instead of following the UK government with a hefty increase in the higher rate threshold, one of the policies that the Resolution Foundation has said will help to take the UK back to levels of inequality not seen since the days of Margaret Thatcher, we instead decided to freeze that. As a result, we are asking people in Scotland who earn more than £43,000 a year not to pay more tax than they do now, incidentally, but to forego a tax cut of approximately £7.70 a week. Now, there's been a lot of misleading commentary about that decision. It has been reported that it makes Scotland the most highly taxed part of the UK. That actually isn't true. It completely ignores the fact that the Scottish Government has also chosen to protect households from council tax increases for 9 years, something that didn't happen in the rest of the UK. Average council tax charges in Scotland are significantly lower than in the UK as a whole, to the tune of around £300 to £400 a year. Even now, the level of council tax increases in Scotland, a maximum of 3%, is lower than the 5% increases permitted in England. But the argument about tax, and this is actually my more fundamental point, the argument about tax in any country shouldn't simply be about what you pay in. It's also about what you get back. For many households, if they have children at university or parents who need personal care, or if they themselves need prescriptions, the benefits of living in a country with strong universal public services outweighs the benefits of £7.70 a week tax cut. Now, I've stressed the principle of universality because I think it reflects a bigger principle. Universal services, in my view, are part of an important social contract between government and people. We invest in public services to help provide a secure, stable, inclusive society for everyone who lives here. We believe that by doing so, we can help to encourage people's talent and enterprise and ambition, and we can help to ensure that Scotland is a place where people want to live, work, invest and visit. And as part of that, we don't try to always divide society between one mass of people who contribute taxes and another group who receive benefits. That, in my view, doesn't reflect reality. We help and support everyone to contribute to society, and we enable everyone to receive some common services or benefits. In my view, though again, I wouldn't want to overstate this, one possible reason why the result of the EU referendum was different in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK is that perhaps while things are by no means perfect, we've been able to demonstrate a more inclusive approach to policy and policy making. That doesn't mean, as I say, that everything is perfect. Of course it doesn't. And it certainly doesn't disregard the fact that a very substantial minority of people in Scotland, 1 million people in total, voted to leave the EU. But it may mean that that sense of being left behind or ignored, which is often perceived as a factor in the wider UK Brexit vote, played less of a part here in Scotland. In addition, the institutions established by devolution command, certainly in relative terms, widespread confidence. According to the most recent figures, over 70% of people in Scotland trust Scottish governments to act in Scotland's long-term interests. That's more than 3 times higher than trust in United Kingdom governments. And it's possibly worth just stressing that. It's not 3 percentage points higher. It is actually 3 times higher than trust in the UK or in UK governments. So in my view, the distinctive approach to politics, which has been enabled by having a parliament of our own and which has been pursued by successive Scottish parliaments and governments, may be, at least in part, responsible for the different EU referendum results that we saw in Scotland and the rest of the UK. However, it is that distinctive approach that is also now challenged by the outcome of the EU referendum. Having our own national parliament and a government located here in Scotland has unquestionably made the governance of Scotland more democratic, more representative and more responsive to people across the country. But after 20 years of progress, devolution in Scotland is perhaps now facing a graver challenge from the current Westminster government. The democratic deficit which fuelled the demand for a Scottish Parliament in the 80s and 90s has opened up again. The Brexit process has perhaps emboldened a more powerful Westminster faction now, which perhaps never fully embraced devolution and which perhaps sees Brexit as an opportunity to rein back the Scottish Parliament. In place of multinational UK democracy, some see Brexit as the way to claw back ground. This direction of travel is clear when we examine what happened before, during and since the Brexit vote. In the 2014 independence referendum, a key plank at that time of the Better Together campaign was the assertion that a yes vote would put our EU membership at risk and a no vote would secure it. However, in no time at all after Scotland voted to stay in the UK, we faced an EU referendum, even though, of course, the Conservatives, whose policy it was, returned just 1 MP in Scotland at the general election in 2015. The Scottish Government argued that 16 and 17-year-olds should have the vote in the EU referendum, just as they did in the independence referendum, but Westminster said no to that. We also argued that EU citizens should be allowed to vote. Westminster also said no to that. And we took seriously the argument that was made often in the independence referendum that the UK is a partnership of equals. We proposed on that basis that the UK should only leave the EU if all 4 countries within it voted to leave. The kind of double lock arrangement that is seen in some federal countries across the world, in Australia and Canada, for example. After all, if the UK truly is a partnership of equals, that should be reflected in the reality of legislation as well as the rhetoric of campaigning. But Westminster ruled that out as well. So a clear pattern of Westminster closing the door on compromise with Scotland and often closing their ears to the democratic voice of Scotland was already emerging. And that pattern has continued. When the vote itself came, Scotland voted by a 24-point margin to remain in the EU. Every single one of our 32 local authority areas voted to remain. The Scottish Parliament voted by 92 votes to 0 to mandate the Scottish Government to explore options for protecting our relationship with Europe and our place in the single market. Now, the party I lead was clear in its manifesto for last year's Scottish elections. We said that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to propose and hold an independence referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. However, a referendum on independence hasn't been our starting point. I didn't decide on the 24th of June last year to immediately exercise that mandate. Instead, since June, the Scottish Government has consistently sought to find common ground or areas of compromise with the UK Government. During the autumn, we argued strongly that the UK Government, notwithstanding its exit from the EU, should remain inside the single market. We still support that solution. In my view, that remains overwhelmingly the obvious compromise solution for the UK as a whole. It would reduce perhaps the worst economic consequences of Brexit, and it would also be the most democratically justifiable option. After all, 48% of those who voted across the UK chose to remain. So did 2 of the 4 nations of the UK. Even in Wales, which voted to leave, the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru are now jointly arguing for continued single market participation, which they say could include remaining part of the European Economic Area. But again, the UK Government said no to this. The Prime Minister's speech last month confirmed the policy of a hard Brexit outside the single market. And it's important to note, I think, that even although the Prime Minister said shortly after she took office that she would seek to agree with the devolved administrations a UK-wide approach to the triggering of Article 50, something I was very heartened by at the time, her speech ruling out continued UK membership of the single market was made without any prior consultation whatsoever with the Scottish Government or indeed any of the other devolved administrations. Now, as things stand, there remains one further opportunity for compromise. The Scottish Government has proposed that as part of its negotiations, the UK Government could seek an outcome that would allow Scotland to retain single market membership. Now, that would mean we would continue to benefit from free trade and free movement of people. Single market membership under these terms, I should stress quite frankly, is not an ideal scenario for Scotland. For example, it seems almost certain that it would mean that while we would be inside the single market, we would be outside the European Customs Union. And our proposals address the technical issues which arise from that. But although elements of our proposals are complex, they are undoubtedly complex and less than ideal. In a sense, that is inevitable. Everything about Brexit is complex, and in my view, everything about it is less than ideal. But we've already seen that the UK Government rightly is considering special measures to ensure that an open border is maintained in Ireland. Gibraltar's circumstances will undoubtedly also require special attention, and we've heard lots of talk about special or specific deals for sectors of the economy, the car industry, for example, or the financial services sector. All of that is right and proper given the circumstances that we are in. But they also demonstrate a willingness to be open-minded, and these times require open-mindedness, fresh thinking, creativity and flexibility. And the Scottish Government has tried to bring these qualities to our discussions with the UK Government. So far, of course, the UK Government has refused to commit to putting our proposal forward as part of its Article 50 aims. And again, despite its promise to listen and to seek agreement, whenever Scotland's voice is asserted, the reaction appears to be to say no. I mentioned earlier that we were told during the independence referendum that Scotland was an equal partner in a family of nations. But the EU referendum last June was the most important UK-wide decision of my lifetime, of many of our lifetimes. And when the Scottish Government made proposals on how the referendum should be run, we were ignored. When people in Scotland voted to remain, we were outnumbered. Now, when we are doing everything we can to seek compromise, it looks as though we are being disregarded. Now, there are those who argue, and it's perfectly legitimate for them to do so, that as the vote was a UK-wide one, the result in Scotland is essentially an irrelevance of mere academic interest. But I think that argument denies a long-established constitutional and political tradition in Scotland, one that goes well beyond the confines of my own political party, and that is that Scotland as a nation should always have the right to determine our own destiny, and that the people of Scotland should be able to determine the form of government best suited to our needs. The UK government and Parliament, to their great credit, accepted that principle back in 2012 in the Edinburgh Agreement and in the legislation that followed. After the independence referendum, that principle informed the work of the Smith Commission and appeared in its final report. But I would argue that the actions of the current UK government in relation to Brexit and the devolved administration seem to disregard that principle. And they go further than just a lack of partnership in forming a common position with regard to Article 50. In some respects, they threaten to undermine the existing basis of devolution. Because far from the promises that the Leave campaign made in the EU referendum that a Brexit vote would automatically see swathes of new powers repatriated from Brussels to Holyrood, there is not yet any real guarantee that the Scottish Parliament and other devolved administrations won't, in fact, be stripped of some of our existing powers. In my view, and it's a very strong view, the post-Brexit landscape would and should demand a rebalancing of powers across the UK. It is time surely to consider whether, for example, employment law should be devolved instead of left at the mercy of a UK government that has already threatened a race to the bottom if the EU negotiations don't go its way. And surely, and Scotland is not the only place arguing this, London has argued similar in recent times, surely it is now time for a real debate about where power over immigration should lie and whether, given the differing demographics of different parts of the UK, a one-size-fits-all policy is any longer really fit for purpose. But far from being open to these discussions, it seems that the UK government wants to go in the opposite direction. It's clear from statements so far that even elements of fishing and farming policy, which have been wholly devolved competencies from day one, now risk being taken back to Westminster. I think that would be unacceptable. It would betray the claims and promises made during the EU referendum campaign, but more profoundly, it would undermine the basis of the existing devolution settlement. So I began my remarks by talking about the 1997 referendum. That referendum, of course, gave rise to the 1998 Scotland Act, which in turn led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. After that Act had been passed by the Westminster Parliament, Tony Blair gave Donald Dewar a signed copy of the Scotland Act. It's now kept in the Parliament building at Holyrood. And the Act was inscribed to Donald with these words from Tony Blair: "It was a struggle, it may always be hard, but it was worth it. Scotland and England together on equal terms." Now, that Scotland Act was a significant achievement, a lasting testament to Donald Dewar's career in public service. And Tony Blair's sentiment was undoubtedly a generous one, but it wasn't quite accurate. Scotland is not on equal terms in the United Kingdom, and the EU referendum, I think, has demonstrated that more clearly than ever. The entire process so far has echoed those words of Canon Kenyon Wright from 28 years ago. Again and again, the elected representatives of the Scottish people have voted against these policies. Again and again, the UK Parliament has imposed these on Scotland. Now, there are no easy answers to the situation we find ourselves in as a result of Brexit. It's one which is not of our making or of our choosing. But the basic question we face is actually quite a simple one. What sort of country do we want Scotland to be in the years that lie ahead, and who gets to decide that? The policies of Scotland's elected parliament since devolution provide some sort of an answer. They suggest that the people of this country overwhelmingly believe in a Scotland that is progressive, internationalist, outward-looking, connected and compassionate. These values and priorities are threatened by the type of Brexit that the UK government appears to be pursuing, one which, notwithstanding the rhetoric, is inward-looking, regressive, and which is ignoring time and again the views that are being expressed in Scotland. Now, the UK government, of course, still has an opportunity to change course and to seek the compromise that we are open to, and I very much hope that it takes that opportunity ahead of the triggering of Article 50. However, if it doesn't, it will show that the democratic deficit which people voted to end in 1997 doesn't just endure. It continues to have the potential to cause harm to our interests, to our international relationships, to our very sense of our own identity. And so if the circumstances arise, proposing a further decision on independence wouldn't simply be legitimate, it would arguably be a necessary way of giving the people of Scotland a say in our own future direction. It would offer Scotland a proper choice on whether or not to be part of a post-Brexit UK, a UK that is undoubtedly on a fundamentally different path today than that envisaged in 2014. And in the absence of compromise from the UK government, it may well offer the only way in which our voice can be heard, our interests protected, and our values upheld. As a result of the Brexit vote, we, Scotland and the UK, stand now at a crossroads. Decision taken in the months to come will reshape our economy, our society, and our place in the world. In short, they will shape the kind of country we're going to be. The question is, should we decide for ourselves with which path to take, or are we willing to have that path decided for us? We may all offer different answers to that question, but surely the choice should be ours. Thank you very much for listening this evening. I now look forward to some, no doubt, spirited discussion about the way forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much indeed, First Minister, for that very thoughtful address and covering a wide range of topics such that we would expect from our First Minister. I'm sure there'll be many questions. I'd just like to ask you, if you do have a question, to raise your hand in the normal way. If you're selected to ask a question, could you introduce yourself, please? And could you make sure that it's a question and not a statement? That way we'll get through more of the audience's questions. So can I open it to the floor, please? Yes, first hand here.
Hi there, I'm Craig Browning, I'm an actuary. Over the last year or so, the world's become switched on to the concept of fake news, and you touched on that yourself, talking about the headlines about tax. I think that's a very damaging thing in our society, and I'd like to ask what you think can be done about it.
Okay, you want me to take one at a time?
Yes.
Or you want me to?
I'll take one at a time, okay, just now until I'm sure we'll get ahead of steam.
I'm glad we started with a nice easy one and not controversial in the slightest. First thing I would say is I think we all, and politicians, have got a particular leadership role here. We've got to be very careful that we don't extend this definition of fake news to cover any news we don't like or agree with. Perhaps that may be how some leaders are choosing to interpret the definition. You know, all politicians rant and rave. I do it most mornings at things that are on the telly or radio or in the newspapers. Most of them are not fake. Most of them are just things that I don't agree with the particular interpretation or the particular facts that have been chosen to inform that. But you know, that's just tough. That's democracy, and that's the role of a healthy, vibrant media. And I should say, I shouldn't have to say it, but I will say it, the role of a healthy, strong, robust, vibrant media in any democracy is absolutely vital. And you know, the fact that politicians rant and rave about the media is often a sign they're doing their job properly, not a sign that they're doing anything wrong. That said, we live in a society where the sources of news for people are much more varied. So the sources that, you know, I grew up with, the BBC, the Glasgow Herald as was then, you know, they still exist, but people can go onto the internet, onto Twitter and Facebook, and find all sorts of sources of news, the quality of which can be variable. And there is undoubtedly a sense in parts of the internet that stories get put out there and get traction that have no basis in fact. And, you know, there is a healthy debate just now, or perhaps an unhealthy debate, about how much of that is deliberate and who might be behind some of that. So I think it is a real phenomenon that all of us, journalists, politicians, the public at large, have a legitimate interest in, because, you know, it's important that people, whether they agree or not with what they're reading, they can trust what they're reading and make up their own minds based on their own opinions of it. So I think it is an important topic of discussion, and an important topic for us all to think about. The last point I would make, having said very firmly what I believe the role of the media is in a democracy, is in a democracy the media also have a responsibility to make sure that they're reporting not in the way politicians want them to, but in a way that is accurate and informed by fact. And that has always been an obligation on the part of the media, and an obligation that the vast majority of the media undertake very well and very responsibly. But perhaps that responsibility on the media's shoulder, given the diversity of the media these days, is also something that we should also just be aware of. So it's an important, I suspect we're going to talk a lot more about this in the months and years to come. And, you know, as well as that general debate, as I say, there are some much more serious and potentially sinister aspects to it in terms of the forces that might be at play behind some of what goes on in areas of the internet.
Okay, thank you. Great first question. This gentleman here.
Thank you. Thomas Ward. I work in business and philanthropy. The UK government seems determined to regard an Article 50 notification as being irrevocable. So if it turns out, as negotiations proceed, that there is a greater and greater risk of having a crash out of the EU without any agreement, that's simply what will happen. Would the Scottish government consider joining a legal action now to help get a legal ruling about whether an Article 50 notification could actually be withdrawn?
It's something we have informally been invited to do, and have, you know, made the judgment that it would not be appropriate or timely for us to do that at this stage, for a variety of reasons. But, and this is probably a wider point I'm going to make here, this issue of whether Article 50 can be revoked or not, and I sort of fleetingly mentioned that in my remarks. We talk about that very much in a legal sense, and, you know, as I'm sure many of you have, I've read Article 50 now many times. I've spoken at length to Lord John Kerr, who was one of the authors of Article 50. His view, incidentally, is it would be possible to revoke it if there was political agreement to do so. But in many of these respects, when you're talking about things around the EU, and the same was true around some of the debates about Scotland's position in the EU had we voted for independence in 2014. We talk about these in a legal sense, but often, you know, these things will be decided politically, and then what the political agreement is, the law will accommodate and follow. So I think if it comes to the point where the UK government wants to revoke Article 50, and I think we've all got to be pretty honest that seems like a big if at this stage, but if that was to happen, in my view, whether or not that would be possible would come down less to a legal interpretation of it and more to whether there was a political agreement amongst the EU member states in order to do so. And I guess that would be determined at the time by the political dynamics. So no, we've not decided that it would be an appropriate thing for us to do. You know, we always keep these options under review, but given the focus of our attentions at the moment, it's not something that we've considered would be an appropriate thing from time, resource and other aspects for the Scottish Government to join in terms of a legal case.
Thank you. And this question in the second row here.
Thanks, Ellie. Nicola, you've described pretty well the...
Sorry, can you introduce
Oh, sorry,
yourself?
Ross Martin from SCDI.
Sorry, I know him.
Yeah.
I'm not sure everybody else does, but I do.
You've described pretty well the fragility of the political context in which we're operating at the moment, and your attempts to introduce some agility into the Brexit negotiations without mentioning across the water. Made slight reference to what's happening in America. So today we learn that there's potential challenge to the firmament of the WTO, for example. How much intervention from across the water could prove helpful or could box in the agility that you're trying to introduce into the discussions?
I think that is almost an impossible question to answer right now. It's possible, and I'm about to do it, to speculate on the dynamics and how an intervention or interventions from across the pond might influence the dynamics, but I think it's impossible to predict. I mean, if you think about things, how the election of the new president has affected things so far, I think firstly, the election of Donald Trump, rightly or wrongly, I'm not commenting on the rights and wrongs at this stage, I'm just saying as I see it, I think the election of Donald Trump undoubtedly emboldened the hard Brexiteers in the UK government at a time that was probably quite influential. So around about the time that decisions were being reached about in or out of the single market, suddenly you have the election of a president saying, I'll give you a trade deal. And so you get that faction gets emboldened. The other dynamic, perhaps going in the opposite direction, is that you have a new president that, again, rightly or wrongly, is not as sympathetic to or supportive of the European Union as an institution as perhaps others, a previous one was, or others would have been. And so that leads perhaps more to a sense of defensiveness, maybe that's not the right word on the part of the EU, but more of a sense of the EU has to hang together. And I think one of the most determinative dynamics in this whole thing from the EU side is what is an obvious point, is that if the EU, and I should say, I want the UK to get a good deal out of Brexit. It's in Scotland's interest, whatever our constitutional future might be, it's in our interest that the UK gets a good deal, and I want to see the UK get a good deal. But if you're on the EU side of the table, one of the key things in your mind must be if the UK leaves and is seen to do better, or at least not suffer any detriment from it, then we threaten the integrity of the whole European Union. And I think that the Trump attitude to Europe probably reinforces that need to protect the integrity of the EU. So these dynamics, I think, are very potentially powerful, but very hard to predict at this stage. I would be sceptical if I was... I find it hard to put myself into the kind of Boris Johnson mindset, but if I was... I can't believe I'm about to utter the sentence if I was Boris Johnson, but if I was of that kind of, coming from that perspective, I would be very sceptical about the idea that a protectionist, or what appears to be a very protectionist US administration, is going to be the great saviour in terms of, even if you thought it could compensate for loss of trade within the EU, that it would, certainly without quite a high price attached to it. So, you've raised a very important question, but one that I think is really difficult at this stage to answer with any certainty. It probably just reinforces the point that the next period is going to be difficult to predict and highly uncertain.
Thank you. I'll take 3 questions together. The lady, and then the gentleman beside you.
Hi, Helen Chambers from Inspiring Scotland. We've had several years of turmoil. The only thing that is clear about the future is there'll be more turmoil, and whatever happens, the dust will have to settle on the consequences of it. I've got a significant concern that whilst this is going on, we're going to take our eye off the ball for critical issues like child poverty, general poverty, inequality, gender disability. How can we manage to actually get through what we need to do, whatever the end result, and actually still move forward on these absolutely critical agendas?
Well, I think that is a very important and very legitimate question, and it's one that occupies me on a day-to-day basis. For me, as First Minister, every single day my priorities are education, health, childcare. I've spent the afternoon, I've spent the morning at Cabinet, lunchtime with having a Cabinet session with a group of young people, and all afternoon ensconced in a session with our international education advisors, talking about our attainment challenge and how we take forward education reform. So these things are absolutely critical to me, and my focus has to absolutely be on all of those. But you can't isolate yourself from what's happening in the world. And the other point I would make is that much of what we're talking about here in terms of Brexit, in terms of Scotland's future direction, they are in many respects inextricably linked to these issues of, as you have rightly focused on child poverty and education, health, and all the rest of it, because they will impact on our economic climate. They will impact on the public spending climate over the period ahead. So, often, people will say, opposition politicians will say to me, forget about Brexit and do the day job. Brexit is part of the day job because it has such an impact on the environment in which we're operating in. So you can't see these things as separate or isolated. But for me, I said, probably touched on it when I was here last year, I've made education such a central part of the priorities we've set for this term of Parliament. And whatever else is going on around us, I'm determined that we will absolutely stay focused on that because it is so important in terms of many of the other things that we've got a responsibility to deliver. In fact, you mentioned child poverty. We are about to take legislation through the Scottish Parliament on child poverty, which will make us the only part of the UK that's actually still having statutory targets on child poverty. Now, setting targets is not enough, but it gives you that focus on doing it. So our legislative programme and our wider programme is hugely important, regardless of what is happening in terms of the wider constitutional issues.
Okay, thank you, First Minister. This time we'll take 3 questions.
Okay, and I'll try to be slightly briefer in my answers. It's what you're,
Hold
what you're
your
really
excitement.
telling me.
So the gentleman who was next to Helen, first of all, there's a gentleman here at the front with his hand up and at the very back.
George Brechin. You said a minute ago, First Minister, that you wanted a good Brexit. Brexit, of course, is a fairly poor shorthand for UK exit. Can you speculate on what might be, or indeed if there is, a good outcome of Brexit for the island of Ireland, north and south?
Okay. This gentleman here.
My name is Ian Doig. I'm an accountant specialising in risk management, so I want to talk about risks. First Minister, I think you've said you want to not only hold an independence referendum, you want to win one. And you've also said an independence referendum is highly likely. And if I was in your position, I'd be weighing up the pros and cons and the risks. So my question...
That sounds about right.
My question to you is, if you hold an independence referendum and lose it, what do you do then? Do you have a plan B?
And at the back of the room.
Chris Carr, University of Edinburgh. First Minister, does your government and your lawyers accept the UK government assumption that the only way they can honour the referendum is which means putting in controls in September 2019, is that the only way is through giving very early notice, giving a full 2 years notice of Article 50, as opposed to delaying deliberately to see the outcome of the forthcoming European elections in the hope of a much better deal, given the options that could present to Britain?
Okay. Well, let me take question 2 first. My plan B. I feel as if I'm back in the independence referendum campaign already. What's your plan B was the perennial question asked then. Look, my predecessor, I don't always quote my predecessor, but he had a quote that I'm going to rely on now, which was, he didn't comment on hypothetical situations. I'm sure he broke that rule on many, many occasions. But, if, I'm getting several steps ahead of myself here. And, of course, if there's a second independence referendum, I would want to win it. I wanted to win the first one. But these judgments are not just, and I don't want to sound awful pious and kind of altruistic here, but I'm making a serious point. These judgments are not always driven and should not always be driven by narrow calculations of party, political or individual interest. I try to, I possibly don't always succeed, pretty sure I don't always succeed, but I try to measure these judgments in what I think, and others will disagree with my assessment, but with what I consider to be right for the country. One of the things that troubles me at the moment, looking ahead, and I've made clear what I'm trying to achieve in terms of finding some compromise, is that we are at this crossroads moment. The UK is heading down a a very different path to the one that was envisaged in 2014. Now, it's perfectly legitimate if you're sitting here thinking that's a great path for the UK to be heading down, but it's a different one. And the question for me is, should Scotland simply be taken down that path by default, regardless of what our views of it are, or from a democratic point of principle, should we get a choice in that? And if we decide that, that's fine, but shouldn't we have the choice of that versus something different? So that's one of the things that weighs in my mind about the democratic choice that perhaps if things develop as they appear to be, that maybe Scotland has a right to make, and it would then of course be Scotland's choice. But just to come back to your question, if we are in that scenario, I wouldn't be intending to lose, and therefore your question is completely hypothetical, and based on the law of my predecessor, I don't have to answer it. So in terms of George's point, this is hugely serious, and I obviously don't have the responsibility of making sure that Brexit happens in a way that doesn't cause damage to the Irish peace process, but all of us should be concerned about that. One of the things that I think is most regrettable about the way in which Brexit, the referendum was proposed and gone through, and the aftermath was treated, is that there was almost a complete disregard for some of these really, really serious issues that might arise because of it. Nobody in the referendum gave any real thought, so it seemed to me, about the implications for Ireland. And those implications are serious. There's an election in Ireland in Northern Ireland the day after tomorrow, and there is some. We'll see how the election turns out, but there's some serious concern about the ability that there will be to reform a government. And people, and I hope it doesn't come to this, people are talking about the possibility of the resumption of direct rule in Northern Ireland, which would be really regrettable, and let's hope that doesn't happen. There's no doubt, and I'm saying this as an outsider, but as an outsider who has had conversations with the First Minister and the former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland over the past months, that Brexit is one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that has destabilised the political situation in Northern Ireland. And that's before we consider issues about the border and the implications of not managing, and as I say, I hope we do manage to get solutions around the border that would avoid a hard border, because the implications of that are really quite serious. So I think it's got to be one of the key priorities of the UK government, and I know people in Europe also see this as a priority. Whatever else happens or doesn't happen, that care is taken to ensure that nothing arising out of Brexit damages the peace process, which was so long worked for and so hard won that it would be absolutely criminal if this process was allowed to put that at risk again. And lastly, Chris, your point about the issue, as I understand it, and I refer you back to my point about law versus politics when it comes to decisions in the EU, but my understanding of the Article 50 process is that once it's triggered, the terms of it set out a very clear timetable. There are provisions within Article 50 that would allow that timetable to be extended, but beyond that it sets out a clear timetable. What, though, is entirely within the gift of the UK government, and we've seen this already, it's 8 months now since the referendum, what's entirely within their gift is the time at which they choose to trigger it. Now, I accept the politics UK-wide that if the UK government had waited and waited and waited forever to trigger it, then that may have caused some political disquiet. I absolutely accept that. I do think, though, there is at least a question mark, quite a big question mark, about the time, the precise time that the Prime Minister has opted to trigger Article 50. Because once that's triggered, you set that 2-year time scale unless it's extended, and yet within a matter of weeks from triggering it, there's going to be elections in France. Within a few months of triggering it, there's going to be elections in Germany. There is an unpredictability, put it no stronger than that, about the outcomes of those elections. But as well as the unpredictability about the outcomes, it immediately eats into that time, because until the latter part of this year, there's going to be certainly a German government that's very focused on an election, and it is difficult to see how the talks get the momentum they might otherwise have got if Article 50 had been triggered at a different time. So I think there is a question mark over the wisdom of choosing this particular moment in time, or in a couple of weeks' time, or whenever it will be, to trigger Article 50, because, as I say, whether it can be revoked or extended, all of that will no doubt come down to politics. But on the reading of Article 50, once it's triggered, the clock is ticking against you. And when you're the one trying to get a deal, perhaps the clock ticking against you is not what you need to put you into the strongest position.
Thank you. Now, we've got two questions already. A gentleman in the grey hair, sorry.
I don't want
Now,
to
that would be difficult to find.
diplomatic and say that doesn't narrow it down. But
The gentleman I'd indicated earlier, here, yes, and then the lady there in the middle, and then this gentleman here. That's this next three, and then next.
Thank you. Charlie Jeffrey, University of Edinburgh. Nicola, you made a very powerful argument about the principle of choice. I'm wondering about choices. And in the paper you produced in December, you set out one possible vision of Scotland's future, which involved the full repatriation of powers from the EU, additional powers in areas like immigration, where there's a specific Scottish justification, and rights to represent those powers in external affairs. Could the choices in a future referendum include a choice like that, as well as some of the other ones with which we've become familiar?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Vanessa Glynn, European Movement in Scotland. First Minister, you and your government have made very clear your continuing attachment to being part of the European Union going forward. Would you like to see Civic Scotland, the people of Scotland, being more vocal and more active in their support of their European future? And how would you recommend that they best go about that?
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. And then this gentleman here at the front. All right. Okay, Jeremy had his hand up.
Thank you, Jeremy Peat, former director of this institute, and very proud to have started this series. Nicola, I very much agree with you that the impact of Brexit is likely to be, and I think I quote correctly, profound, long-lasting and damaging on our economy. And I can well understand why, given this crazy decision and the difficulties you've had in discussing options for Scotland subsequent to the referendum, I can well understand why the possibility of a second referendum is high on your agenda and many people's agenda. However, I would suggest to you that it is very important that if and when we have such a referendum, that the choices are absolutely clear to us. And one thing that worries me if the referendum...
Sorry, can I ask you to ask your question? And we're running out of time.
Okay, very quickly. If the referendum were held before the 2-year period post-Article 50, would we know what the choice is if we stayed in? And if you are not absolutely clear on a commitment to re-entering the EU as a matter of priority, do we know what the option is if we go for independence?
Okay, I think there were two there, but...
Okay.
First Minister.
Charlie, I mean, the simple answer to your question, of course, you can, choose to, frame a referendum in whichever way you want. We, as has been well documented, there was discussion before 2014 about the possibility of a multi-option referendum, and for a variety of different reasons that didn't happen. I think there are some issues thrown up by the concept of a multi-option referendum, not least what the thresholds for the winning option is and how you get a clear result out of that. As somebody who favours very much one of those options, I've always thought it's not necessarily for me to advocate another option, but it would be open to others to do so. Obviously, there is some debate just now around the federalism option. And I guess whether or not you have an option like that on a ballot paper, although this argument may be less if it's on a ballot paper and wins in a popular vote, but it's perfectly legitimate to argue for a federalist solution. It's a perfectly respectable point of view to have. It seems to me that the big flaw in it at the moment is deliverability. Scotland can't unilaterally turn the UK into a federalist state. There would have to be a UK government that was in agreement with that in order to make that work, and presumably you would have to have the different regions of England in agreement with that in order to create a genuinely federal structure. And we don't have that at the moment. The current UK government is, as far as I can judge at the moment, pretty adamantly against that direction of travel. And the Labour Party, it's not clear to me whether the Labour Party at UK level even agrees with that, but if I can be gentle and polite, I'm not sure that a Labour government anytime soon is a realistic prospect to deliver federalism or anything else for that matter. So the big flaw, I think, is how does Scotland turn the UK into a federalist country if the rest of the UK doesn't want to be a federalist country? And you might lessen that as an argument if you've got a popular mandate in a referendum, but that still doesn't enable Scotland to say to the rest of the UK, we demand that you federalise as well. So that, to me, I think is the big flaw, and thus far the unanswerable flaw in terms of the federal proposal. Vanessa, in terms of your question, would I like to hear Civic Scotland be more vocal about its support for Europe? Yes. I think, to be fair, much of Civic Scotland has been quite vocal in that, but of course I am passionate about Scotland's place in Europe, so it stands to reason that I would like to hear others be similarly so, though it's not for me to tell Civic Scotland what it should say and how it should say it. One thing I would like, and it kind of flows from this, but one thing I would like is all to become more vocal about, assuming you all agree with what I'm about to say, and some won't, I accept that, because it has profound implications for our economy and for our society. I'd like us all to become much more vocal about the debate on migration and free movement. And I would like all of us to work harder. I accept a leadership responsibility here to challenge the myths around migration and free movement, because that whole debate UK-wide has become so horribly distorted and so deeply depressing. But if we end up with significant restrictions on European free movement, not only do I think that would be wrong in principle, the implications of that for our economy are really quite severe. So that's one issue that I think I would like to see all of us talk more about and try to change that debate, because so much of it is based on distortions and myths that I think really are ripe for challenge. And Jeremy, yes, obviously if there's to be a referendum, I say if, then of course we want those choices to be as clear as they possibly can be. In terms of the 2-year, there seems to me for Scotland, if we are in that position, you of course want to be as clear as possible about the likely UK relationship with the EU, but you want also to be in a timescale where our options don't get closed down, where we still have the ability to fashion our own relationship with the EU without having a situation where we end up diverging hugely. So, in terms of what we know about the discussions to come, and this is unpredictable and is subject to change, as we've been talking about, I think Michel Barnier has said as much, that the outlines of that agreement for the UK really need to emerge by the autumn of next year in order then to go through the ratification process. So, that hopefully is a time when we do start to have more clarity, but obviously there are bigger issues in determining what's right for Scotland in the next step. But of course, for those of us who advocate independence, if we are in the situation of another independence referendum, we've got a duty to answer the questions that were asked of us in 2014, and we answered some, and many think we didn't sufficiently answer others. That will include our relationship with Europe, It will include very important questions around the economy and currency, all of the ones we know about. So I take very, very seriously the responsibility I and others on the independent side would have to put forward the case on these issues in a clear way that would allow people to make a decision, if that's where we're heading.
Thank you. At this stage, could I have an idea of the number of questions that are still requested? Oh, that's good. So this gentleman at the front here, the gentleman in the third row, and at the fourth row. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, First Minister, for that talk. I have a question about the status and position of Scotland's universities.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, yes, sorry. Dr. Stephen Watson, School of Mathematics, University of Glasgow. A question about Scotland's universities in the current context. And I'm going to give you a couple of quotes and then try and feed it through the remarks you've made. So the quote is from Sir Tim O'Shea, you may be familiar with it, who stated in relation to the impact of Brexit that the impact on higher education ranges from bad to awful to catastrophic. Now, Lord Kerr, speaking at University of Glasgow recently, emphasised that Article 50 is about dividing the bills, settling the debt. It's not about trade. It's a money negotiation, and money negotiations are very nasty. And then he had this caveat. So, for example, Horizon 2020 options shrink in the context of these larger money negotiations. Now, you had said, and this is kind of the light or the lens through which...
Question, please.
Oh, yeah. So the question is about the position Scotland's universities find themselves in, and I want to view it through the lens of the democratic deficit as expressed through the treatment of the post-study work visa in the Scotland Bill and what that tells us.
Okay, thank you. And this gentleman here, and then the gentleman behind.
Hi there, Andrew Brown from PricewaterhouseCoopers. First Minister, thanks for your talk. I just had a quick question on air pollution. There's been a lot reported over the last couple of weeks about air pollution levels being very high in UK cities, including Scottish cities. And there's been some consideration given, or said to be given, in the UK government as to a potential scrappage scheme for diesel cars. And I'm just wondering whether or not the Scottish government would support that, or whether there are any other initiatives that you would bring in to reduce air pollution in cities.
Okay, thank you. No. Sorry, excuse me. It was just behind this gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Gavin McCrone. You referred to the paper that was produced in the autumn of last year, Scotland's Future in Europe, which is, I think, a very thoughtful paper and full of all sorts of ideas. But the main argument of it was that Scotland could remain in the single market even if the UK left, and it could also remain trading with the rest of the UK as it does at the moment. You said that the UK government had more or less disregarded this paper, which I think is unfortunate. What sort of reaction have you had in Europe to it?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Stephen, your point about universities is a very important one. I think the impact of Brexit on all sorts of sectors and areas is going to be significant, but perhaps it's the impact on our universities that's going to be amongst the most significant. I'm thinking in terms of the ability to attract students, the ability to attract academics, and of course ability to continue to do what we do very well and punch above our weight in at the moment, take part in research collaborations. And it's not just the funding of research that is affected here, although it is affected in terms of Horizon 2020, but also the ability to collaborate across different countries. So all of these things are impacted. And, you've quoted at least one university principal there. I talked to university principals who will already say that they are experiencing the impact of Brexit in terms of academics from other European countries deciding not to take up posts that they've been offered because they're not sure what their status will be here in the future, through to research academics here being dropped from potential research collaborations because there's a worry that if the UK are included, then that could have an impact on those funding applications. So these are really serious impacts. It's going to be really important to try to make sure that they don't get lost in wider negotiations. Now, you've touched on one of the issues that I think is not yet clear in how the negotiations will unfold, whether they will be entirely sequential in terms of the divorce followed by the new relationship, or whether, as the UK government would prefer, those discussions will happen in parallel. I suspect it might be a bit of both, actually, starting sequentially and moving into parallel. But there are big issues around a whole load of things that will require to be discussed here, and it would be very easy to lose some of the kind of issues you talk about. So it's going to be important for all of us to use whatever influence we've got to make sure that doesn't happen, because the standing and the status and the success of our universities right across the UK, is too important to us to allow to be sacrificed as part of this process. Air pollution, the short answer in terms of some of the things that cities in other parts of the UK are looking at in terms of, are we looking at those and other things? Absolutely yes. Air pollution in our cities is one of the biggest public health challenges we face in terms of important for our wider environmental responsibilities. So as part of our climate change planning, but also in terms of our environmental initiatives, we're looking very closely at what further actions we need to take, not exclusively in our cities, but particularly in our cities, to reduce what are often unacceptably high levels of air pollution. If you want to give me your details before you leave, I can put you in touch with some of those who are working on that in the Scottish Government if you're interested in that in more detail. Some of the statistics around the city I represent part of it in Glasgow in terms of the health impact and premature deaths because of air pollution should make us all realise we've got a lot to do there in terms of tackling what is a significant issue. Gavin, your question is a very good one. The reaction in Europe has been broadly positive and warm towards our proposals. There's a range of kind of detailed responses that I won't. So I'm looking at Jeremy instead of Gavin when I'm answering this question. Go into at the moment. I think two things. There is no doubt that everybody realises our proposals would involve a number of complexities, and we've never tried to shy away from that. But there is a real openness to the idea that everything about Brexit is complex and there's going to have to be creative thinking, so why not creative thinking around this as well as on a range of other things. The main message we've had, and I've been very open about this, is that when Article 50 is triggered, the negotiation is going to be a negotiation between the UK government and the EU, and therefore the message to us has been, if you can get the UK government to put it on the table, there's no reason to expect that we wouldn't be prepared to have a discussion about it, but you've got to get the UK government to put it on the table, because if they don't put it on the table, it doesn't form part of the negotiation. So in a sense, there would be no place for that negotiation to happen. That's why we've put so much focus. We've been working really hard to raise awareness and understanding of it amongst other European countries, but our principal focus in the past number of months has been to try to get the UK government to take it seriously. As I say, time is running out for that, but we're not giving up yet. We still are trying that. And going back to my point about Civic Scotland, any Civic Scotland organisation that wants to lend weight to that, it would be very welcome. But that's been the key message from Europe. Get it on the table. Nobody's saying absolutely it can definitely be done, but get it on the table and we'll talk about it, and there'll be an openness and a willingness, because I think generally there's a lot of warmth towards Scotland and a lot of willingness to find solutions for us, but you first got to get the UK government to put it on the table, has been the message.
Thank you. Two final questions. There's a gentleman there, and one right at the back, waving.
David Gow. There's been inevitably tonight a lot of talk about a second referendum on Scottish independence. But what about a second referendum on EU membership? Article 50 hasn't been triggered yet, but the suggestions are that within about a couple of years from now, the economic outlook will not be as rosy as it would appear to be at the moment, and those negotiations might have gone all wrong. So do you yourself favour a second referendum on EU membership? And which of these two referenda, which we've been talking about, do you think are more important and which actually are more likely?
That's the second question. At the back, please, now.
Jamie Livingston from Oxfam, Scotland. First Minister, you mentioned inequality in your speech, and of course I welcome that. Would you, given your strong personal concern that you've stated about inequality and the fact that your government has placed it at the heart of the economic strategy, do you share my disappointment that the recent Scottish Government report shows widening wealth inequality in Scotland, and notwithstanding the limitations of devolved powers and the welcome initiatives in this area, including Fairer Scotland, Fair Work Convention, would you recommit to making sure that the upcoming Inequality Commission has the ambitious remit that matches your personal commitment to this and the barrier to poverty reduction that economic inequality is creating? Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, we're going with two. On a second EU referendum, I guess it's less about which I think would be more important. You can probably guess on that one, but it's more, you know, do I think a second EU referendum is politically likely? Now, I should say I don't particularly advocate for a second EU referendum. There would be a stronger case for one, I think, than would have been the case in the independence referendum. Because when you think about it, in the independence referendum, now, before I say this, there will be people in the audience who say, yeah, but I didn't agree with that, and that, or this wasn't detailed enough. But we put forward a prospectus. Whatever you think about it, we put forward a 700-page prospectus setting out, you know, the key issues in terms of what would happen should Scotland vote yes. There wasn't as much as one side of A4 setting out what would happen if the UK voted for Brexit. So, you know, while, as I say, you'll all have your own views on the contents of the white paper, it was there and people had the sense of what they were voting for in some of these key issues, whereas that absolutely wasn't the case in any sense in Brexit. You know, we're still arguing today over whether people, you know, thought it would mean in or out of the single market. There was no detail apart from the £350 million a week for the NHS on the bus, which has since been jettisoned, and that turns out it wasn't important. There was no detail. So in terms of a referendum to endorse the settlement, while I'm not advocating it, there would certainly be more of a case for it than I think would have been the case in the independence referendum. Whether that's something that is ever going to gather momentum in a UK sense, I would be sceptical about at this stage, I have to say, although I think many people have commented, and there's some legitimacy to this, that public opinion will be unpredictable around Brexit over the next couple of years as the detail of what it means in practice unfolds. Jamie, in terms of your question about inequality, I'm always disappointed if there is anything showing widening of inequality rather than a narrowing. The wealth inequality gap, in terms of the statistics you refer to, what those statistics showed was wealth increasing across all income sectors. The gap widened because of increase in pension wealth at the top end of the spectrum. That was the reason for the widening gap. In terms of some of the drivers of income inequality at the moment, I referred, I think, in my speech to the Resolution Foundation report from a couple of weeks ago, and you know, some of the drivers there were in terms of tax policy, the threshold change I talked about, and of course welfare changes. So these are two things in which the Scottish Government, firstly on the tax threshold, has taken a different view. We've not taken a different view on the increase in the personal allowance, which was also mentioned in that report. But we're also, as we take over welfare powers, looking at what we can do to make a difference through, you know, the proposal we've put forward for an early years grant, for example, to try to use those powers to have an impact on the income inequality gap. But in answer to your question, will we make sure? Absolutely, because, you know, the inequality gap, whether it's income, health, education, these things are not easy to close. They've been generations often in the making, but it is absolutely central to my notion of a fair Scotland that we tackle those gaps in equality. So it will be central to all of these initiatives that we seek to take.
Okay, thank you very much, First Minister, and I'd like you all to join with me to thank the First Minister this evening for her excellent address and for answering our questions. So so graciously. Now, I'd now like to call on Dr. Victoria Martin, who's just going to give us a short address. Victoria is the immediate past co-chair of the Young Academy of the Royal Society. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's a bit daunting coming up here after the First Minister, but thankfully I don't have to take any questions. So I'm very grateful to have this opportunity just to present the Young Academy of Scotland to this audience. So the Young Academy of Scotland, I sometimes describe it to people asking as the kind of junior branch of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but we're really not that. We're really a kind of independent organisation, and this is our host academy here at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. We were formed 6 years ago. We currently have 131 members. We're younger than the regular academy, so our age range at the moment is 27 to 46. Which, First Minister, means you're still young, just, like myself, actually. And one thing we're quite proud of is not by doing it as a priori thing, but we've managed to get a very good gender balance. We have 53% of us are female and 47% of us are male. And we've just done that by applying the criteria for membership as equally as we possibly can. Most of us are academics, we're 79% academics, but we do have artists, practitioners, business people and people from the government and charities that work with us. And we're really trying to bring a multidisciplinary approach to the work that we're doing. So I guess it won't surprise you to learn that our theme, we don't pick a theme every year, but the themes do kind of evolve. And our main theme for this year is Brexit. But we are trying to work out how best to engage with the process. Given that Brexit is most likely going to happen, we want to make sure that we can get the best deal for Scotland and we can get the best deal in the areas that we're interested in, so for universities, for academics. And doing that, we're working with the Scotland Futures Forum. One of our main concerns that's already been brought up in today is free movement, and we think that's very important for young professionals in Scotland, and keeping that would be very good. You can see that two of our themes here are equal and international, so it is something we are very concerned about, and also making sure that during the Brexit process that equality is always maintained and enhanced wherever that's possible. So Ray said I was going to give you some insight on how to make something, a society like ours that's gender balanced. And I don't really have any one magic bullet that we did. But because we have managed to do that, we've been trying to reach out and work with other people in Scotland to try and instill the sense that we have of equality. And hopefully it's something that we can keep on going in Scotland. So we have been working where we can with schools, with young peoples, and also in prisons. One of our recent activities is called Rewrite the Headlines. And this we've been doing this actually for 6 years since we started, but it's very relevant now because it builds on the kind of fake news agenda. So we've had a blog that looks at articles in the media and dissects them when they have a sexy headline, smoking is bad for you. That's a very poor example. But we actually go back down and we dissect the research that's been presented in that one headline and in the article, and actually try and give a much balanced picture of what that research was actually saying. And we've taken this idea out to schools. We had this competition called Rewrite the Headlines, where we encourage schools to look at different articles on science and technology and the arts and see if they could rewrite the headline for a piece to make it still snappy but more accurate. That's not the only thing we've been doing with young people. We've been hosting the Lego League, which is a robotics competition for teenagers up and down Scotland. Recently, I guess if we had a theme for last year, it was the kind of refugee crisis. And we have worked on something called Silent Histories, They're the silent histories of refugees in Scotland that we've made a film about, and we've made information packs to take to schools so they can engage with this issue. Finally, just because Ray said I would say something about diversity, gender balance, one thing that we did last year was we came up with a brochure called Academic Women Now, and basically it has stories of female academics and their path to success in their current role in Scotland. And they include, you know, where they did their studies, but also journeys they've made on the way, perhaps if they've had children or if they've taken some time out from academia, to kind of illustrate to people that if that's the kind of career you want, there's not one fixed path to do that, but you can take a meandering path to do that, or you can just take the traditional straight-headed path as well, and they both work. So we've done that for academics because we're mainly academics, but at the moment we are considering a non-academic version also to give kind of career aspirations to men and women throughout Scotland about how you can, as a educated person in Scotland, but as a professional in Scotland, build up your career, and there are many paths to do that. Okay, so that's just highlighting some of the things that we've been working on recently, and again, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce YAS to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And thank you again to the First Minister. I'm sorry, Nicola, I nodded off when you announced the date of the referendum, so perhaps you'll tweet that to me later on. And thank you to Ellie Wiseman for conducting the Q&A so well. This is the fourth time we've done the politicians and professionals. We couldn't do it without the support of the professional organisations that you see listed on the board there, so we're very grateful for them. Just as Brexit is part of the First Minister's day job, it is part of the day job for the David Hume Institute, and our next session is on the 22nd of March, when we have an American view of Brexit, Trump, and all that that's going on from Craig Parsons, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Oregon. So I recommend that to you. Please join us in the foyer for a drink, and there is an exhibition of portraits in an adjoining room, and you might recognise one of the portraits in that exhibition, but I'll leave you to that. Thank you very much indeed.